Thank you very much to the Honourable Minister. Our next speaker is Ron Clark from Aird and Berlis.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating overview of the Nigerian electricity system, and I think it'll be very interesting to contrast that market with the way the Ontario market works, and I'll take you through the history and development and current operation of the Ontario electricity system. Do we have my slides on the screen? Eventually. I'll get started. So, in Canada, I should mention, first of all, that unlike Nigeria, each of the provinces has its own electricity system and its jurisdiction for its own. So we have 10 very different electricity markets and systems. In many of the provinces, such as Saskatchewan or Quebec, there continues to be a vertically integrated government-owned monopoly. In other provinces, particularly Alberta, has gone the furthest towards introducing market mechanisms. It's a fully unbundled and market-driven electricity system. In Ontario, we kind of started down the path of moving towards a full market and then made a bit of a U-turn at some point, and now it's what's called a hybrid market. I guess we're still not going to have my slides. Okay, I'll just describe it in word pictures where we are. So back in 1990, if we kind of go back there, get in our time machine and go back to 1990, we're kind of where the Nigerian electricity system was around that time too. Also vertically integrated, government-owned monopoly, an entity called Ontario Hydro, which had responsibility for transmission and generation and, dispatch, if not market operation, because there was no market. We had municipally owned distribution entities, which is something that's a bit different from the Nigerian context. And the Ontario Energy Board, which is the regulator, just played an advisory role. There was some contracting for independent power producers, but it was very small. There was about 1,800 megawatts out of, I don't know, the 50 or 60,000 capacity that was contracted for. So if we move forward 23 years to 2013 now, in around 2000, so around the same time, slightly before Nigeria went through its transformation into unbundling, Ontario did more or less the same thing. In fact, the similarities are quite striking. So Ontario Hydro was broken up into 5 different entities, so transmission and market operation and generation, electrical safety, and I think I'm forgetting one, but you get the idea. So that unbundling took place.
I don't have a copy of your presentation. If
okay.
you have it in your pocket, we can set it up.
Okay. Matter of fact, this is a copy of my presentation in real time. I thought I had it. You know what?
No. Okay.
Sorry. There you go. Meanwhile, I'll continue. So where we are is exactly where we get to the part of the story is where Nigeria is, more or less, in terms of the unbundling, again, of the vertically integrated utility, and the introduction also of IPPs. The difference, one of the differences, I think, is that the generation entity continues to be the key incumbent in the Ontario context. So, which is Ontario Power Generation is the successor entity in the generation context, and they have, we'll see, there's nuclear, that's also obviously a big difference, and there's considerable hydroelectric, and I understand, Madam Minister, in fact, you're going to Niagara Falls tomorrow to see the falls, first of all, but of course it's a power plant as well. Now, if you ask most of the people in Ontario where their electricity comes from, they'll say, oh, it's Niagara Falls. In fact, that's only a small percentage. As I say, we do have nuclear. And nuclear is about, in fact, meets about 35% of the demand and 50% of the energy. One of the key policies that the province has adopted in Ontario, which is quite different, there we go, is quite different from the Nigerian context. There we go, we skipped ahead. Is moving off of coal. So about certainly 8 to 10 years ago, coal-fired generation made up 25% of the generation capacity of the province. Within a few years, it'll be down to 0. So that's something that in North America or even globally has gone too far. Now, there's a cost to that, but that's a policy that the Liberal government committed to, and there have been various deadlines that have been a bit delayed, but we're going to move within a couple of years to having no coal-fired generation in the mix from 25%. So obviously something had to take the place of the coal-fired generation, and there's a few things that have happened in the meantime. We'll get into that. So that's where we are now in terms of implementation of that. So the transmission system, Ontario is pretty big. You don't get the size of it. I think Nigeria is about, I don't know, half or 60% the size of Ontario. So you could get the idea how big Canada is as well. But most of the population, you'll see, is concentrated in the south, where most of the transmission network is. So you'll see the big, long transmission lines to the north are bringing in power from large hydroelectric projects. But then there's a lot of gas-fired and generation closer to the southern part of the province as well. There are some interties to neighboring provinces and neighboring states in the U.S. as well, but there's limits to what those interties can bring in. So as I mentioned, the off-coal policy was adopted by the provincial government, and in Ontario now we have what's called a hybrid market. So what's the hybrid? The hybrid is some of the elements you'll recognize from Nigeria as well. The hybrid part is you have a bulk purchaser, a single buyer. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Power Authority, which in a very similar way acts as the purchaser, the credit-worthy counterparty for PPAs and new procurement of new generation resources of all kinds. So that part is very similar, that parallel between the bulk purchaser and the Ontario Power Authority. So the Ontario Power Authority enters into contracts, generally 20-year contracts for renewable and gas-fired generation, 40-year contracts for hydroelectric power because of the differences there. And now, that's one part of the hybrid market, which is the regulated part. The other part, as I said before, we started to go down a purer market approach initially, and so all the mechanisms for a spot market in Ontario were created. And again, that's another distinction between the Nigerian situation and the Ontario. So we created the mechanisms for a spot market, and that was supposed to set the market clearing price. But of course, if you're going to introduce renewable energy in particular, the price is always going to be much higher than the spot market price, and those 20-year contracts are going to be higher. So what a consumer sees on the electricity bill in Ontario is not the market price when they pay for the commodity, but it's the aggregate of all the contracted prices when we talk about the commodity. And the difference, so you've got a market price that sets it, but you've got the aggregate of contract prices, and the difference we call here in Ontario the global adjustment. And so the consumer, despite what the market signal is, the consumer is going to pay for the additional price necessary to cover all the costs above market price of renewable generation. And that brings us into the feed-in tariff program in Ontario. So this was, in some ways, a great leap forward. This came out of the time in 2008 during an economic crisis where Ontario, as much as the rest of the globe, was thrown into a recession and market uncertainty, and there was great concern about jobs, job losses and economic downturn. So the government of the day had the idea, okay, we can solve a few problems at one time. We can solve moving our generation resources towards cleaner and greener. We can solve also the jobs and economic issue by creating a program to procure renewable energy. And then the last problem was, well, what if we end up buying solar panels from China or, wind turbines from Europe, et cetera? So they also introduced a domestic content requirement for that feed-in tariff program. And that's that resulted in significant amounts of power generation being procured, renewable power. And by renewable, mainly solar and wind, but some biomass and hydroelectric as well. And we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that were invested. Now, of course, all of that eventually that cost has to be borne by the consumer, and it is, but that's a choice that has been made. And it's not to say there isn't some backlash against the high cost of power, because there certainly is in Ontario. Those of you who live here know about that. However, that's where we are. And you can see some of the numbers in terms of what's been procured. The numbers are big. I think I heard the capacity in Nigeria, I want to say 4,500, 5,000 megawatts. So in Ontario, we're at 50 or 60,000 megawatts, I think. So it's quite different. With a population of 12 million, I believe, something like that, versus your 160 million. So you start to see the difference in the numbers in terms of what's being generated and the capacities. So here we have the feed-in tariff program has resulted so far in about $10 billion invested. So that was the first generation of the feed-in tariff program. And then, in fact, we've just launched recently the second generation of a feed-in tariff program, which similar sort of contract, but a procurement mechanism that creates advantages for community groups, locally sourced involved power through cooperatives, and something that we have which isn't exactly parallel, which is Aboriginal groups as well. So those involvements, there's advantages, and they go to the head of the queue in terms of the contracts that are going to be awarded. So this is, a typical feed-in tariff, the result of you can see a bit of snow there. So even though we don't have as much sunshine as Nigeria, we still make it work in terms of procurement of solar power. This is, obviously a relatively small solar power in someone's backyard or in a field, et cetera. But we see a lot of those things that they didn't exist at all. And it's obviously something that can make a lot of sense in the Nigerian context, much more than in Ontario. So if we can do it here, it certainly can be done in Nigeria. And we have, now this is one kind, there's also rooftop and there's also large industrial utility scale in terms of fields that have lots of solar panels, but you start to get an idea. This is something that you never saw in Ontario 5 or 7 years ago, and now you're seeing quite a lot of. And then the other part of the procurement story is new gas-fired generation. Remember I said we moved off of coal completely, so significant amounts of new gas-fired generation have been procured in addition to renewable energy. And in fact, most of the procurement was done in advance of the economic downturn. So we've got a problem now, which is probably the opposite of what you have in Nigeria, which is, in fact, there's too much electricity. Okay, and in fact, it has to be, some of it has to be curtailed. And I think that's, we've got some numbers about megawatts, but that, I think, gives you an idea of where we are in Ontario as compared with Nigeria. Thank you very much.